Hi, everyone. For some of you, it is good evening. For some of you, good afternoon. But thank you for joining us and welcome to Densho's webinar on teaching Japanese American wartime incarceration in the elementary classroom. We are so excited to have you all here and along with our excellent panelists today. So just a quick note that all of the resources from today's workshop, including the certificate of completion, can be found at this bit.ly link. You can also use your phone if that's easier and scan the QR code. But that will have, the slide deck, the certificate of completion. It'll have our session evaluation as well as other key important links that you'll find throughout the session today. And I'll make sure I kind of drop this link throughout our time together, just as folks come in to make sure that we can get access to this as well. And before I begin, I would like to start by doing a land acknowledgement. As an organization dedicated to documenting historical and political violence and promoting social justice, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that Densho's main office is located on occupied Duwamish and Coast Salish land, and that Muckleshoot, Suquamish, and Snohomish peoples have also called this place home since time immemorial. Japanese American incarceration, like all of American history, took place on occupied indigenous land. Not only were Japanese Americans unjustly imprisoned on stolen land, but indigenous peoples, including Alaska Natives with mixed Japanese ancestry, were also incarcerated during World War II. These patterns of displacement, confinement, and forced assimilation are part of a broader history of white supremacy and settler colonial violence. To fully dismantle these injustices, we must first fully recognize them. This acknowledgement is not just a statement, it is a call to action. The issues of xenophobia and racism that we discuss today are inextricably tied to the history of settler colonialism. Any meaningful racial and social justice work must include a commitment to decolonization. Densho's work focuses on the history of Japanese American incarceration, but this history does not exist in isolation. The incarceration of Japanese Americans at sites like Fort Sill, Oklahoma, is part of a larger pattern of state-sanctioned confinement. Fort Sill's legacy includes its role as a Native American boarding school, where children from Comanche, Apache, Kiowa, Navajo, and other Native American nations were forcibly separated from their families and culture, and as a prison for the Chiricahua Apache people, including their later Geronimo, who was buried there. These violent legacies are not relics of the past. Fort Sill, once used to imprison Japanese Americans, was recently proposed as a detention center for immigrant and refugee children. Other former incarceration sites like Lordsburg, New Mexico, and Crystal City, Texas, have been repurposed to enable today's crisis of family separation and mass detention. These cases of incarceration, whether in World War II or today, are deliberately hidden from public view, making it easier to dismiss them as isolated events rather than part of a larger historical pattern. By acknowledging this history, we commit ourselves not only to remembrance, but also to action. Decolonization requires tangible steps to dismantle oppressive systems and honor Indigenous sovereignty. This includes internal learning about the intersecting histories of Japanese American incarceration on Indigenous lands, supporting local Indigenous communities or national land back campaigns, and engaging in critical education work. Our work helps us see that all these histories are intertwined and inspires us to take meaningful action to undo them. Thank you for pausing with us to reflect, learn, and move forward together. And for those of you who are new to Densho, just want to share a little bit about us. I'm sure, as you heard from the land acknowledgement, right, that we are focused on teaching and educating others on the history of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And that's our mission, to preserve and share history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans to promote equity and justice today. Densho is an online archive and public history organization that documents the stories of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And for our time together, we have a few key objectives. So the first is exploring the significance of teaching the history of Japanese American incarceration during World War II in elementary classrooms in particular, which is why we're really excited to have Noreen with us. To identify essential historical concepts for effectively teaching this history to young learners, And finally, to use recommended resources and practices to teach this history. Sorry. So we are going to spend our time together by first, we're about to conclude our welcome and opening with some introductions. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time doing a moderated discussion and hearing from our panelists and experts. We'll have some time at the end reserved for Q&A from the audience. So if you all have questions, please make sure to write them down and record them here so that we know to answer them. And then finally, we'll close out. So just to introduce the folks who you're going to be hearing from today. So first, my name is Courtney Y. I use the she, her pronouns, and I am going to be the moderator, and I am the Education and Public Programs Manager at Densho. Here with me today is my esteemed colleague, Brian Niiya. He is also going to, like I said, be a panelist and bring that really grounded historical perspective to not only this webinar, but also to Densho's work. And he is a content director at Densho. And we're also incredibly excited to have Dr. Noreen Naseem Rodriguez with us, who is, again, another panelist, and she is an assistant professor of elementary education and educational justice. She works at Michigan State University, where she is also core faculty in the Asian, Pacific American, and Muslim Studies programs. She engages critical race frameworks to explore how racial and cultural experiences impact pedagogy, the pedagogy and curricular enactment of Asian American and Latina pre-service and in-service teachers. She also studies how educators teach so-called difficult histories to young learners through children's literature and primary sources. Her current Spencer Foundation-funded project examines the implementation of Asian American studies in K-12 classrooms across 5 states. A former elementary teacher with 9 years of experience in Austin, Texas, Dr. Rodriguez continues to support educators through professional development and teaches across a wide range of topics, including social studies methods and Asian American education and bilingualism. She is the recipient of multiple early career awards recognizing her contributions to equity, justice, and teacher education. And just on a personal note, one of the reasons why I'm really excited to have her here is I've read 2 of her books and I highly recommend them. So one is Social Studies for a Better World, an anti-oppressive approach for elementary educators. And the second one, believe came out pretty recently, is Teaching Asian America in Elementary Classrooms. And you can find her on Instagram, Blue Sky, and I also included the link to her website in the bit.ly link, but I'm also dropping all that information in the chat for you, should you want to follow her. And just a quick note on tech reminders. Again, just want to note that the resources page can be found at the bit.ly link listed on the screen. You are also welcome to use a QR code if that's easier. But we invite you to engage with us. I know this is a webinar, but we would love for you to use the chat to share connections, aha moments, or any other comments. Please refer to the resource page for important links. Know that there is a Q&A function, right? So if you're looking at your screen, it's probably at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. If you have any questions for our panelists at the end of the webinar, we'd love to have you record that there so we can make sure we answer them. And then finally, we are going to have as you all know, we are recording this webinar, but future viewers will only see our faces and anything that's written in the chat. So just a security note for you all. Our esteemed colleague Niiya is also here. She's not on screen, but she's going to be helping moderate the chat. And if you have any tech issues, please feel free to reach out to her. And she's listed under Densho Zoom, and she'll be able to support you all. Okay, with that being said, I think it's time to get into our moderated discussion, which is the reason why I know you all are here, and we're very excited to really get into this program. So our first question gets at the why, right? Why should elementary educators teach the history of Japanese American wartime incarceration? And Brian, I would love to hear from you first.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I should point out that I'm coming at this from the perspective of a public historian, not an educator. So, see my remarks from that standpoint. And in thinking about this, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. And I think the Japanese American incarceration topic is, I think, one that enables many children to see themselves to see themselves and their own stories reflected, but also seeing others as well. And in terms of seeing themselves, I think unfortunately many children today are going through things like family separation, anxiety over immigration, being singled out due to race or culture. And all of those things are reflected in incarceration narratives that they may be able to identify with. And there are many stories in the incarceration literature of resilience, of rebellion, of enduring that may help them get through any kinds of similar issues that they may be facing today that they can identify with. Um, and I think on a more literal level, seeing themselves in the sense that although we've come a long way, depending on what part of the country you're in, I think those of Japanese or Asian descent are still kind of underrepresented and often represented in ways that are stereotypical or negative. And just if you are Asian American, Japanese American, just being able to see someone who looks like you, who's going through similar kinds of experiences is something that is valuable, while at the same time, recognizing that all Asian Americans are not alike. And in fact, there are issues sometimes, with other Asian Americans, sometimes having particular stereotypes and ideas about Japanese Americans, stemming from events of a long time ago as well. The other thing I would point out before I have other thoughts, but I want to throw it to Noreen first as well, is that I think another thing that makes the incarceration story particularly relevant for elementary educators to teach a variety of topics related to incarceration is that it's to a large extent it's a story about children. About a third of those incarcerated Japanese Americans were children. And so there are many child's eye experiences and accounts of the incarceration. In fact, I would argue that there are disproportionately that incarceration accounts are disproportionately come from those who were children in camp, in part just because of the way the demographics of the community work. I mean, in Densho, we've interviewed hundreds of Japanese Americans who lived through the incarceration. And just because most of those we interviewed in the 2000s, just by virtue of who's alive at that time, most of those people were children in camp, and the stories they tell are often from that child's perspective. So I think that that's another thing that makes it relatable in a lot of ways to getting at some of the difficult issues embedded in the incarceration story. But I'll stop there, and yeah, I'd love to hear what Noreen has to say.
Well, to build off what Brian just shared, I think it's important to note that out of all the various ethno-racial groups that are represented in state standards, Asian Americans are the least represented out of all ethno-racial groups. But the few occasions when Asian Americans are required to be taught tend to be in secondary standards, middle and high school, particularly high school and U.S. history. And it's in relation to the Chinese at some point in the 1800s and Japanese Americans during World War II. And there's nothing more frustrating for children to get to high school when they feel like they've already learned about World War II before, and then they realize that there was domestic encampments where people were imprisoned, where US citizens were imprisoned. And for a lot of folks, I hear all these stories about how they're like, I couldn't believe that I didn't learn about that until I was in high school or until I was in college, or sometimes when they were already teachers. And there's just no reason for us to hide that. It may be uncomfortable to talk about if most of your social studies instruction is focused on just patriotism, but it did happen and it's a part of the World War II story. So if you're teaching about World War II in elementary schools, you should be addressing incarceration to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during that time period as well. Also, to Brian's point, there are so many resources available specifically about teaching Japanese American incarceration to young children. It doesn't only have to be in high school. In fact, if we think about the assortment, availability of children's literature about Asian American histories, Japanese American incarceration is by far the most common topic, aside from things related to family and culture. And so there is a huge breadth of available resources that are perfect for, I would say, probably second through fifth grade or sixth grade, depending on where elementary shakes out where you are. but there's a lot you can do. And I think it really appeals to kids' sense of justice. And if you're teaching about social justice, if you're teaching about civil rights, it tends to be done, especially in elementary, but not exclusively, through a black-white binary. And Asian Americans are projected to be 10% of the US population by 2050. And we need to make sure that we're including those Asian American histories as part of our efforts to teach about the real history of this country. I know that's more contentious in some places than others. I am from Texas. Um, but it can be done because it actually is what happened. And I'll share some examples of ways that you can make some local connections later on in our conversation today. But I just think it's really important that we find ways to go beyond that binary and to go beyond the 1950s and 60s, because injustices were happening for centuries before then, and they continue until the present. But we often teach young children about civil rights and social justice as if it was only a problem, particularly during the 1960s. MLK gave his speech, schools got desegregated magically overnight, which was absolutely not what happened. But that's the narrative that we tell particularly young children, and it's misleading and it's inaccurate, and we can do better. And luckily, we have the resources to take up that work in ways that are really powerful. And again, speaking to what Brian mentioned, a lot of the stories do tend to focus on those on the experiences of children. And I'll be sharing some really specific examples of connections you can make, but kids love learning about things that other kids experienced, and they can really put themselves in those situations and try to imagine what it was like. And so when you have this depth of resources that are absolutely appropriate for elementary children, and you have these opportunities to talk about things like empathy, friendship, displacement, belonging, all of that is related to civic agency and action and engagement. And it's also a part of US history. So there's lots of really important pieces that you can touch on through teaching about Japanese American incarceration with young children.
Thank you all so much. And I think that's kind of a perfect segue into our next question, which starts to get into, right, what are some essential historical concepts for effectively teaching this history to young learners? I'm sure there's a lot of elementary educators on here. And even for me, right, as a former middle school teacher, sometimes I wrestle with like, what is developmentally appropriate, right? Like we know students can handle difficult, nuanced histories and conversations. We know they can handle these challenges. But what does that look like, right? Especially for young students. So yeah, Brian, curious to hear from you.
Sure, yeah. So for this one, I felt like this is not something I could talk about without some help. So I reached out. It turns out my best friend is an elementary school teacher who's been teaching about incarceration for many years. His name is Glenn Kitayama. So thank you, Glenn. He may be, I think was gonna try to join this call. So take a bow if you're here. But what he told me really struck home. He's someone who's also very knowledgeable about the incarceration, was active in the redress movement, has contributed to, Densho's online resources. But he said that he starts his lesson about incarceration with a photo of his own grandparents who were incarcerated. That it's so important to make it personal. And I know, most teachers may not have a personal connection. But you know what? Densho has interviews with hundreds of Japanese Americans, individuals who you can tell, a specific story about. Um, I don't teach elementary school. I do teach at the college level though, and I use this where I assign my students, to uh, do projects based on specific oral histories in the Densho archive, and we unravel and do research and unravel different aspects of that family story as we go through the quarter. And maybe Courtney, that's one of the projects we can take on later on, is maybe identifying some of the key oral history storylines or specific oral histories that might be, really appropriate for introducing elementary students to this story. Because, as we've mentioned, many of those who incarcerated, many of the people we interviewed were in fact elementary school students at that time, and their stories, I think, would be very relatable. Um, another thing Glenn mentioned is just, having a discussion to see where children are in their knowledge about the topic, which is likely quite minimal, and maybe exploring if there are, pre-existing stereotypes about Japan or Japanese Americans that may spill over. Um, and then to note that, there's such a wide range of stories. The Manzanar Historic Site, there are about 10,000 Japanese Americans who are incarcerated at Manzanar. And, the historic site used to have the slogan, 10,000 carcerees, 10,000 stories. Everyone has their own individual story. So there's so much to choose from that might resonate particularly with your student. I think we'll talk a little bit more about some specific resources, so I won't go there yet. But I will say that Densho does have some resources that can help you identify particular resources that might be appropriate to a particular child, a particular region, a particular theme, or whatever. And then I guess the other thing I would add is just you don't want to sugarcoat things and all, but for maybe an elementary audience to focus on stories of maybe those who went through similar struggles that students go through today, but that maybe made it through these difficult times by building community, finding allies, being true to your principles, and showing how many Nisei lived through these difficult times and got through those difficult times, as a way to point to ways that to point to what we hope will be a better future. So yeah, I'll stop there because again, I'd love to hear what Noreen has to say.
So I have slides. In terms of the concepts that you would want to address as a teacher, I think I mentioned this earlier, but most young kids have a really strong understanding of fairness, even if they haven't really had a lot of robust US history yet. So that's something that you can leverage. You can talk about concepts like what's fair and what's not fair, but then start moving toward the language of just and unjust. So we can also think about it in relationship to the rights that people are guaranteed as humans and also as citizens. And so in terms of social studies, so my area of focus as a teacher educator is social studies, very, very familiar with the various standards that folks have to address in different states. And in most elementary grade level standards, you have an assortment of social studies disciplines. It isn't just history. And so I wanted to include a few different concepts that you could mention or that you could hit as you are teaching about Japanese American incarceration. So in terms of citizenship, what does it mean to feel like you belong somewhere? Who is viewed as American and who is not? Why and how has that changed over time? So that's something you can start off very simply with young children, or you can move into more sophisticated things, looking at laws and timelines and looking at racial categorizations and classifications, like with fifth graders, for example. You can also talk about it in terms of history, thinking specifically about why some Asian Americans were simply unable to become naturalized citizens. That was not an option for them. And so because they had immigrated to the United States as adults, there was no pathway to citizenship for them, which when you get to the topic of the loyalty questionnaire becomes very important to understand. But oftentimes it's not something that's brought up in traditional US history teaching, particularly at the elementary level, but it's an important conversation to have, especially given what's happening today. And then also in terms of the discipline of government, thinking about constitutional rights that are guaranteed to US citizens and how the federal government enforces those rights. Young children usually have very little understanding of what it means to actually exercise the rights that you are given as a citizen. Usually we just talk about voting, but there's a lot more to it than that, things like due process. And there's lots of organizations that have prepared wonderful materials so that you can really dig deeply into any of those concepts related to social studies. Another really big thing that tends to be emphasized more in secondary rather than elementary, but is absolutely possible with young children, is this idea of historical thinking, where as an educator, you're engaging young children with primary sources. And this is really commonly seen in AP US history classes when students have to deal with document-based questions and primary sources, but you can definitely do this with the young children. And so when I say primary sources, I mean those firsthand accounts from the past. So typically people think photographs right away. It can also mean maps. It can be journal entries, diary entries, newspapers, IDs, flyers, any sort of things from that moment in time. Compared to secondary sources, which is what elementary educators tend to use more of, because it's going to come in things like your textbooks or in a historical fiction piece of children's literature. Sometimes it'll be a news story, or if you have Social Studies Weekly or Scholastic News, there's lots of different kind of newspaper leaflet style text that people are using instead of textbooks in some places. Those are all secondary sources because they're not actually coming from the people who experienced those events at that time. And so in historical thinking, you do want to engage students in this process of interpretation with primary sources. You don't want to tell them what to think. You want to give them this historical document and see how they make sense of it. And often for secondary, people use a lot of historical texts. With young kids, that poses a challenge. If you have I was going to say if you have second graders, but this can be true of fifth graders too. You can have struggling readers in fifth grade who would be really overwhelmed by really dense historical text, even if it's just a paragraph. So some of the suggestions that I usually give folks who are interested in doing historical thinking with younger students is to just modify things. So when you're using primary sources with elementary students, you want to emphasize the importance of figuring out whose perspective was this taken from and who do you think they wanted to see this and why. And so if you're looking at a photograph, just ask simple questions like who took it? If you're reading a letter, you could focus on who is addressed at the top of the letter. You could focus on the date that it was written, and you can focus on who signed it. That's a starting point. And then you could highlight specific pieces of text. You could paraphrase it. You could type it out. There's lots of different things you can do to make it accessible to all of your students. And then thinking about things like if they're looking at the time at the year that something was created, or if there's a year listed, what do they know about that time period already? Have they learned about that? Is there something they associate with that period of time? What's familiar? And then also what is unfamiliar? What are some things that they're wondering about? And so, like I said, I have some suggestions at the bottom there of ways that you can modify primary sources to make them more accessible to young learners. For students who are struggling readers, maybe if your students are multilingual and they need some English language support, lots of ways that you can do stuff that's simple, highlighting, just putting a box around the sentence you want them to focus on, and then really giving them an opportunity to make sense of things. Sometimes after I've given children some time to spend with primary sources, I'll say, okay, I want you to, out of this whole selection of pictures, pick 2 or 3 that you want to caption. Pick 2 or 3 that you thought were the most powerful or like were the most surprising to you, right? Like giving them an opportunity to curate things so that what they're writing about is really important to them and they have a lot of opinions and they can back those up. And so, like I said, there's a ton of resources available now that were not available when I was teaching this stuff even like 10 years ago. So these are all hardcover books. Some of them are more expensive than others, so definitely request these from your libraries. But Impounded and Un-American are collections that are honestly for all ages. Adults would appreciate them very much as well. And so the one on the left is exclusively photographs taken by famous photographer Dorothea Lange. Un-American features her photography as well as that of Ansel Adams and other government photographers. Seen and Unseen is a little bit newer, and I really love this book because it's kind of a combination of traditional children's literature, graphic novel, and then it just has tons of primary sources everywhere. And that includes the photographs by Lange and Adams, as well as Toyo Miyatake, who was actually imprisoned in a camp himself. He was a photographer in Little Tokyo, and he brought some of his camera equipment with him, and then he fashioned his own camera at the camp out of scraps that he found. So he was taking photographs as an insider, as someone who was living the life in camps, not just a guest swooping in to take a few pictures and then they get to go back to their comfortable life. So I really like how there's that opportunity for comparisons and contrasts with Seen and Unseen. And then Dear Miss Breed is a collection of primary sources that I'm going to share a little bit more about on the next slide. So this is the description from Densho. You can find a much longer version. This is just a small excerpt. But Clara Breed was a children's librarian in San Diego, and many of the students that she served in that role were Japanese American. And then when she found out that her students were going to be leaving their homes and she didn't know when they were going to be coming back, she met many of them at the train station, and she had just ordered all these postcards. So she self-addressed them, put stamps on them, and she said, "Write to me when you go to camp." And so Dear Miss Breed, the book that we saw on the previous slide, is kind of a upper elementary, secondary collection of the different letters that the children wrote to Miss Breed and that Miss Breed wrote back to them over a period of many years. And then Write to Me came out more recently. That is a picture book that you could read with younger children between like 1st through 3rd grade. If you want a quicker read, you could also read it to 4th and 5th grade if it's something that would just kind of help you get through the lesson a little bit quicker. than traditional nonfiction. But I love this story because if you're at a public school, hopefully you have a librarian. I know those are getting cut, but that's someone who's familiar to your students more than likely, right? Or whoever is at the local public library. So they can probably imagine the relationship that they may or may not have with that librarian. But I think it's really interesting to think about the people who were helpers as well as the people who were experiencing imprisonment. And so this helps people understand what it was like for children to experience the camps and also the ways that other people outside of the camps supported them. So to be able to read a child's letter is really, really powerful. And so I love being able to share the story of Miss Breed and the students that she engaged with.
Thanks. And just a shout out to Melinda, that who wrote Seen and Unseen is excellent. I used some stories from this for a seventh grade presentation on the camps. It also has good basic questions to ask in it. So thank you, Melinda, for sharing that. I think, Brian, you've also written about this book as well, right?
Yes, yeah. And as well as the children's picture book, yeah, which I agree is very good. It's kind of funny that two of the most recent children's picture books about related to the incarceration have librarians as their protagonist. That one
Mhm.
and a more recent one called Love in the Library, based on the author's, I believe, grandparents or great grandparents who met in the camp library in one of the camp libraries. So yeah, there are children's picture books on many different topics, and I think all of them are good in different ways. And the best one might be ones that appeal to your child or children's particular interests, whether it's baseball or pets or friendship or yeah, there are different entree points for all of these, or a geographic location, and so forth. So yeah, and just to build on what Noreen mentioned, is that um, one of the things that's changed in just Japanese American studies over the last decade or so is just, and I think this is true of many fields, but just especially in Japanese American history, is just an enormous amount of material has come online in the last decade or so. Some of it driven by the fact that there are both federal and state kind of civil liberties grant programs that have funded a lot of this scanning and digitization. So Densho has enormous amounts of photographs, letters, including letters and journals by children, in our archive. But UC Berkeley has digitized hundreds of thousands of pages of material from the War Relocation Authority that administers the camps. So you will find yearbooks, from the schools that were in camp, children's writings, children's assignments, even from camp schools, that I think are fascinating primary sources, from that time. Um, the picture books that Noreen mentioned with the War Relocation Authority photos, both the National Archives and UC Berkeley have digitized thousands of those photos, and they're fascinating, because they were taken for a specific propagandistic purpose by the federal government to promote a certain message. But what can those photos, looking at them today, how do we view those photos today, and what can they tell us about both what the government was trying to sell us about them, and what do we see in them today that makes them still interesting and useful? And then, through organizations like Densho, it turns out that there were many photos that were taken by the incarcerees themselves, that have a different perspective because they were taken not by the government. Although I have to say that, it's kind of ironic how similar those pictures are, right? Because the Japanese Americans themselves are taking pictures. Um, you know, when do ordinary people take photos? It's mainly for happy occasions, for anniversaries, for birthday parties, for those kinds of things. So, and even though cameras were allowed in the incarceration camps, eventually cameras were initially banned, but after about a year in, they were allowed to some degree. But the incarcerees were still not allowed to take pictures of, for instance, the guard towers or the barbed wire. So those types of photos are rare, although some do exist. But this is just to say that there's just an enormous amount of material available now online. And again, maybe Courtney, one of our jobs is to maybe highlight some of those in Densho's collection that would be particularly useful for elementary school teachers and students and teachers at different levels.
Thank you all so much for sharing that. It's just really making me think between, Noreen, what you were saying about historical thinking, and Brian, just the context you were giving about, who's taking the photographs, right? It's definitely giving me ideas as like a former teacher about, how could I potentially pose these different questions to help students think really critically about primary sources, even photographs, right? About, again, like what's missing, right? What does this show? And why is this missing, right? Why do we think this is missing? And to develop some of those critical thinking skills as early as elementary. And so you have also started to get into this, but what are some recommended practices and slash or resources for teaching this history?
So yeah, I wonder, maybe Noreen, wondered if you want to go first on this one, because I would talk more about the resources part, and maybe it would be great if you could talk about the practices part first.
Sure. Yeah. Courtney, if you want to go to the next slide. So I'm going to share some real classroom examples. This is from a second grade classroom in Texas. And what the teacher did was she had been talking to her students about civil rights and social justice for a very long time. And so this, what I'm about to describe, I believe happened in either February or March. But all of January, she wasn't just going to do Black History Month in February, but she really wanted to have her students understand injustices that had happened in different communities over time. And so in January, they had spent a lot of time thinking about the Black freedom struggle, and not just thinking about MLK, but like learning about Harriet Tubman, learning about Nelson Mandela, and thinking about anti-Blackness around the world. They had also learned about things like women's rights. They had also been learning a little bit about labor rights. And so they had a really strong understanding of ways that people had been treated really poorly for a lot of different reasons, and they knew it was all messed up and they did not like it. So they were fired up and ready to go. And so when she started teaching them about Japanese American incarceration, she knew that second graders had not much knowledge about World War II, if any at all. What little some of them knew was just like war, planes, like tanks, like just the fighting part. And maybe like they had a grandparent or a relative who maybe had medals or a uniform, but it was all kind of fuzzy for the ones that did know. So she gave them a very, very basic overview. But really what she wanted them to do was think about how they could engage with primary sources, and then she was going to read a picture book with them. So she did what she called a picture flood, where she cleared off all of the desks in the classroom, and then she printed out the Ansel Adams collection from the Library of Congress. And I think I'm going to share that later. I think I have that on the slide. But I had printed all of the photographs out for her, so they looked like the kind of photographs that we're used to seeing. And so she spread them all across all of the desks. And she had a big class. She also had a student teacher. And so she said, all right, me and the student teacher are going to go around with Post-it notes. I just want you all to look at these different images and wonder aloud. What do you think is happening? What questions do you have? And we're just going to jot those down. And then tomorrow, before we read our next picture book, we're going to start with your questions and see if we can find the answers to them as we read. And so, as you can see, there's a wide range of different images here. Some of them are more landscape, some of them feature children, some feature adults. And her students hadn't learned about Japanese American incarceration before, so they had a lot of different questions. And so these are some of the Post-its that she and her student teacher recorded their comments and questions on. So the kids said things like, they are being treated differently because, oh wait, sorry, the purple ones are after they read the book, sorry. Okay, it's the blue ones. What are the papers for? Why were they at these camps? Why are the kids holding the flag? Who are the people in the pictures? They are Japanese Americans. I wonder if the prison camps are just for Japanese Americans. Why did they have to go to the camp? So they had lots of very good questions. And so the next day when she started reading the book, if we could go to the next slide, she began by reviewing the questions, just like I did by reading them aloud with you all. She read them aloud to all of her students when they were together on the carpet. And then as they read the book, she wanted them to focus on figuring out the answers to the two questions that you see in red. What civil rights were being taken away? What does that make you think and feel? And what do you think could have been done? Excuse me, I'm dealing with some allergies here. So the book that she was going to read with them was Yoshiko Uchida's The Bracelet, which is very well known. It's an older book, but still fantastic. You can pretty much find this in, I think, any public school library and in the country. It's that widely known and well regarded. But I have never seen a group of students get so into a book, but it's because they started off with the picture flood, and many of the same kinds of images that were in those photographs were echoed in the illustrations of the book. And so they looked really familiar to the students. The students recognized some of those images as the ones that they had questions about. And so as she was reading, it was fascinating to see how engaged the students were, because they were like, They were kind of murmuring to themselves as their questions were being answered. Like, they were hyper engaged both with her, but also just like to themselves, like really soaking it in, even though they were only in second grade. Now, they did that in, like I said, February or March of that year. And then her student teacher had to do her total teach thing. So she had to take a pause from her social justice and civil rights unit. But then in May, she told me to come back because she wanted to read this book called Sylvia and Aki with her students. And Sylvia and Aki is a book that I also read to my students when I was a fifth grade teacher. She read it to second grade, I read it to fifth grade. You can really do it across the gamut. And it's fabulous because it contrasts the story of a Japanese American girl, Aki Munemitsu, with the story of Sylvia Mendez from the Mendez versus Westminster case that ended school segregation on the basis of language in the state of California prior to Brown v. Board. So one chapter is told in Sylvia's voice, and then the next chapter is told in Aki's voice, and then they end up meeting at the end, and it's based on a true story. So it's a really engaging and powerful text. And they're young girls. I want to say they're maybe in fourth grade. And so kids love reading books about other kids. And this is the reader response journal that we made for the students. And so this was a great opportunity to integrate social studies alongside language arts, both reading and writing skills. And so students would have different questions, usually more summary questions, but some of them focused on things like problem and solution, cause and effect, generalizations, character traits, all of the things that you have to do in ELA. And so she hit on those things in the reading response journals, in addition to the conversations they had as they were reading each chapter. We had things like primary sources that we included in the book. There's the map of the WRA camps. There's a picture of the camp at Poston, which is where Aki and her family lived. So really, really rich way to do this. Now, this was in May, so it's the end of the school year. Testing is over for everybody. You know, you're kind of spending some time cleaning up your room and wrapping things up. But this read aloud was like the one constant thing that they did every single day, and the kids loved it. And so it's a shorter chapter book. She read one chapter a day for most of the days in May, except for when they had field trips and stuff, and it was a perfect read for the end of the year. Now, these examples are from my own fifth grade classroom, and I spent about a month on World War II. Obviously, very big in US history, and in fifth grade, that's usually the first time that students are spending a lot of time with US history, particularly in the state of Texas. So, like the second grade teacher whose classroom I just shared with you, I also integrated social studies with language arts. And now you have so many more memoirs that exist than when I was teaching this. Like I said, there's just so much children's literature out there. In addition to the many memoirs and examples of historical fiction, you have all those oral histories from Densho that Brian was mentioning earlier. So there's just a ton of stuff that you can use. My approach was to do book clubs. So I was a fifth grade teacher. The fourth grade teachers across the hall from me had been reading Number the Stars for a number of years. And so several of the students that I got in my class, I think I had 30 kids that year, probably about a third of them had been in the classes that read Number the Stars. So I was like, y'all already know what the Holocaust is. So I decided that all of the students that had been in the class that read Number the Stars the previous year were going to read about Japanese American incarceration. And then the remaining students could pick which ones, whether they wanted to be in the Japanese American incarceration book club or the Holocaust book clubs. And then I chose books accordingly. Excuse me. And I loved my librarian. We were besties. And so whenever I had a thing I wanted to do, I would run in and I would say, Kate, I need books about this, and I need them for a range of reading levels, because when you teach fifth grade, you have students who are reading at a middle school level, and you also have some students that might be reading at a first or second grade level. And so I really needed to have a lot of different kinds of books, and she completely came through because there is so much out there. And so you can see some of the books there on the in the picture on the right. It's a little fuzzy. It's very old. But then I pulled a few other examples on the bottom there, on the left side for you. All of those are middle grades books. They Called Us Enemy as a graphic novel. That's probably a little bit higher than middle grades, probably like seventh, eighth grade and up. But I was able to find books for all of my students at their reading levels. And then I asked them to do kind of their standard language arts activities as they were reading, things like identifying the characters, describing those characters, thinking about their interactions, thinking about summarizing the different events. And again, those concepts of like cause and effect, generalizations, sequence. And then we also would meet as a whole class to talk about the historical events that were happening during World War II. And so we had a timeline, we had all kinds of other stuff, but being able to incorporate my social studies instruction with language arts through those book clubs gave my students really in-depth understandings of much more than they would have gotten if I was just doing it during our limited social studies time. And like we've been saying, there's a ton of fantastic children's literature out there. This is but a small selection. If folks want to take a screenshot, but we'll also be sharing the slide deck with you as well. Some of these are a little bit older and harder to find, but then several of these are newer books published in the last 5 years that you can readily find at any public library. And then I think it's important that we share books about the experiences that people had in the camps, but also think about what happened after they left, particularly for folks who were young, whether they were children or teenagers in the camps. And so I wanted to highlight a few books. Yuriko Chiyama is one of the most famous Asian American activists that people learn about, and her family was incarcerated in California. Norm Maneda's family was also incarcerated during World War II. He later had several jobs at the government level, including, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was Secretary of, was it Transportation?
Yes,
Okay.
transportation. I
Hey,
think
I
he was.
usually get those things wrong. Thank you,
Yeah,
Brian.
yeah, and he
And he
held
was also a Boy
another.
Scout. And while he was a Boy Scout, he met a man that would also become a legislator named Alan Simpson. They were very close friends for many, many years. I heard a story recently that even when they were in like their 60s and 70s, they would get together and they would act like little boys because they had known each other for so long. So if you have Boy Scouts in your class, the story of Norm and Alan might be a great hook for them. But like I said, it's important to think about how people who lived in those camps often went on to make that part of their legacy, and often told those stories later on, regardless of the positions that they held, so that people would not forget what happened to their families and their communities. One thing I have seen a lot as people try to teach about Japanese American incarceration is there's this tendency to focus on joy and or patriotism. And I understand that. We're talking about doing this work with young children, and we don't want them to just think about oppression and sadness all the time. They're going to get really upset about it. It's already kind of difficult to make sense of what's happening in the world today. We don't want to just keep dumping on them. But some of the books that are out there, if you only end the way that the books end, you're going to not give your students a full understanding of what happened. And so Baseball Saved Us is a classic text that's been around for over 2 decades. Barbed Wire Baseball is a newer book by Marissa Moss that came out probably like 8 or 10 years ago. Similar stories about baseball at the camps that was played by young people. And both of these books end with these like triumphant images of them hitting the ball. You're assuming it's going to be a home run. It's like that classic all-American image of someone like knocking it out of the park, right? And the idea is that playing baseball allowed them to feel a sense of freedom and joy. And that's wonderful. And that's important, particularly when you're imprisoned. But don't end with that, because after the games, they were still imprisoned. After the games, they still didn't know when they were going to be able to go home. They didn't even know if there was a home to go back to. And so it's really important that if you're going to use those books, you come back to the fact that while baseball was one way that they got to play and have fun and build community, they were still living in really dehumanizing situations, and that was all at the hands of the federal government. Similarly, when we think about stories of Japanese American military participation, we think about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion. Sometimes there's readings that you can find in some workbooks about the Military Intelligence Service. So the different ways that Japanese Americans tried to show their fidelity to the United States through different acts of service. Um, it's still important to recognize that much like Black Americans who had also served during World War II, they weren't always treated with the respect that they deserved. Sometimes they would be spit on while in uniform after the war ended. Sometimes they were treated horribly. And in fact, even though they were going into the military, they were still in segregated units. They were not treated the same way that their white peers were, right? And so I think sometimes people tell these stories of youth baseball and Japanese American military participation to show how much they cared about the United States, but it's always important to remember the United States did not really care about them. So we don't want to twist the story just so we get a happy ending. And then I think this is the last point that I wanted to make. I think it's really important that wherever you are, you look for those local connections. I lived in Colorado for 2 years, and while I was there, I was so excited to talk about Asian American histories because the Amachi camp was there. And so I thought, surely when students learn about Colorado history, they're learning about Amachi. And then I taught my first class to future elementary teachers at CU Boulder, and none of them had ever heard about Amachi, and they definitely hadn't learned about it in their own K-12 experience. So that was a bummer. But a really amazing story that is not a bummer is the fact that a social studies teacher in the neighboring town of Grenada, right outside of Amachi, named John Hopper, his students started to find artifacts when they would go out to the former campsite. And so they decided that they were going to start collecting them, and people started donating their own artifacts. And this social studies teacher and his high school students basically created an archive. They built their own museum. A space later became like donated and dedicated to the museum site that you can go visit today. But it's all because of the work of a teacher and his devoted students that we now have what has become a National Historic Site at Amachi. And so I just think that's an incredible story to share. But even in Colorado, people aren't necessarily learning about it. So sometimes there's stuff in your own state that people just aren't teaching about, but those local connections are already there. And then speaking of Amachi, I just wanted to note that a survivor and former special education teacher of the Amachi camp recently died this past week, Bob Fujigami. So I just wanted to let folks know that his legacy is still alive, and we can honor him by teaching about Amachi and the other camps. And I'm trying to share some examples of local connections that might seem a little bit off the beaten path, because if you're in California, if you're in the places where they had camps along the west, like outside of the West Coast zone, those are a lot more accessible to you. But there are connections in unexpected places. So I lived and worked in Austin, Texas for 18 years, and there is this fascinating story about a man who was imprisoned at the camp in Crystal City, which Texans do not learn about, even though Texas history is required in 4th and 7th grade. We don't learn about the Crystal City or the Kennedy camps. But Isamu decided to stay in Texas after he and his family were released from the camps. He ended up taking up his farming again in the Rio Grande Valley, which is really well known for a lot of citrus and lots of other agriculture. And then when he retired, he moved with his son. Oh my gosh, I meant to Google it before because I always forget his name, if it's like Richard or Robert or if it's something else. I apologize, and I apologize. I can never remember the name of his son. His grandson's name is Evan. Evan's dad. Isamu moved in with his son's family, and his son had been the dean of the School of Architecture at UT Austin, and so he had a lot of connections around town. And in fact, he had designed a lot of major features like the famous hike and bike trail around Lady Bird Lake. There's a very like 70s library that a lot of people recognize because it has such distinctive architecture. And so there's this connection to this famous architect because his father was formerly imprisoned in Crystal City. But it didn't just stop with the fact that his son had a legacy in the city of Austin. Isamu was one of those retirees that needed to be kept busy. And so his son was like, I need to find something for you to do that is outside of this house. And he had connections at the city Parks and Rec department. And so they had a plot of land in this park called Zilker Park that's very well known. That's where the Austin City Limits Festival is held. And so Isamu basically single-handedly built a traditional Japanese garden that was later named in his honor that you can visit today in Zilker Park in Austin, Texas. So his son has his own incredible legacy, but Isamu also made his mark on the city in that way. So I wanted to just share that story as something that I was not expecting to find when I was in Texas. And I happened to go to a library, an Austin History Center event where Evan Taniguchi, Isamu's grandson, was talking about his story, his family's story, and the garden, how his grandfather built it. Another story that I learned about in the last year is Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. It's in South Jersey in Upper Deerfield Township. It's a farm where at one point it was the largest processing plant for frozen food in the United States. They worked with, if you're familiar with Bird's Eye vegetables, frozen vegetables, they produced for that particular brand for a while, and then they launched their own brand. And when people were incarcerated during World War II across the United States, one of the ways they could leave the camp is through a work release. And C.F. Seabrook, the owner of Seabrook Farms, was looking for cheap, exploitable labor, as many people who, are in agriculture do. And so he thought, okay, who would be willing to work here for very little money during the war? Because a lot of their traditional workers were off in the military. And so he had kind of, I can't remember what they called them, basically like a team of folks from Amachi come out and visit to see if they liked it. He also had some folks from other camps come visit too. And they were like, well, it seems legit. You can make good money. There's a school or kids can have daycare and then we can work during the day. So a lot of people started to leave some of the camps to go work at Seabrook Farms. And so at one point, the population of Japanese Americans living in this tiny farming town was 2,500, and their descendants are still alive today. They have an educational center and museum that I visited last week, and I got a fabulous tour by the wonderful Shirin Yoshida, whose siblings were imprisoned during World War II, but she was born at Seabrook. And so we have, again, these legacies of incarcerees all across the country. And so if you can find that local hook, that can be a way to figure out how that matters to your students and to their communities.
Thank you so much, Noreen. Brian, I'll let you close out the moderated discussion. Do you have any just closing thoughts on recommended practices and slash or resources for teaching this history?
Sure, yeah, I'll be very brief because I know we're running close to the end here. But yeah, just to echo Noreen's point, yeah, there really are local storylines everywhere, literally every state. There were, in addition to the main War Relocation Authority camps, there were camps run by the Justice Department in places like New Mexico, North Dakota, Montana, and so forth. There are resettlement stories, people leaving camp for many states. Many Nisei who left camp early went to small private schools in states all over the country, and there are storylines there. So yeah, local stories are great, and there are so many of them. The story of the incarceration is incredibly far-reaching. So I think that's a great suggestion. I just want to end by noting a couple of Densho resources that would be helpful here. One is Densho has a resource guide that includes children's books, films, plays, all kinds of media about the incarceration. And you will find articles on all of these various children's books that have been mentioned at different grade levels. You can search by grade level and topic and so forth. And I think the link to that is in the resource document that is part of this program. And then I've also written about for our Catalyst blog capsule reviews of almost all of the children's picture books, many of the young adult novels, many of the nonfiction books as well, many of the ones that Noreen has mentioned, as well as there are a lot of others as well. And again, the links to those should be on the resource sheet for this. And Courtney and I will be writing about some of the more recent ones that have recently come out or that will be coming out in the coming months. There's still so many stories, as much as there is, there's still so many stories to tell and so many authors who are telling those stories. And, it's great that there's all this material, but it can also be overwhelming that there's all this material too. So the resource guide and some of the blog posts, I hope, are things that can help you narrow down from all of these possible resources, things that might be most appropriate to your particular interests, your particular geography, the particular interests of your class. So yeah, just to note what those are. And then finally, the last thing is that there are also literally hundreds of short videos and films about the incarceration, which are also great resources. We are actually working on a project with the Internet Archive to digitize and put online many of those. It's not up yet, but look for it this summer. Many are currently available on Vimeo and YouTube. But yeah, look for later this summer this project where we will feature many of these, especially older films and videos about the incarceration, because again, there's so many of them, and you know, this would be a way to find many of them in one place. So, but yeah, I know we're reaching the end here, so I'll stop there, and hopefully we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, it looks like you two were so thorough. We don't have any questions, so I think there's just been a just huge amount of helpful information, not just how, but why, right? And what other resources you can tap into that elementary educators can look at. There's already a comment that this was excellent. Thanks so much, and can't wait to share this with my colleagues. So as we close out, we just again a reminder that this resource page is going to stay live, and I can drop in the actual recording once we get a copy of that. So thank you all so much for being here. This is hopefully the first of many webinars. So please help us improve future offerings by completing the webinar evaluation, which I dropped in the chat. But most importantly, thank you to Noreen, thank you to Brian for sharing your perspectives. It's really great to have both a historian and an educator and a teacher educator, both rooted in social justice, both rooted in telling, the full, honest, accurate history of our country. And to have you all on this webinar today. So please stay in touch with us. We have a newsletter at densho.org/teach. If you want to stay in touch with us, and we would love to, again, get your feedback on future offerings. Thank you all so much for being here, and hope you all have a great rest of your evening.